Hello and welcome to episode 442 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Well, I'm okay. People who listened to the last show will know we went on our Christmas do, and I did make, not the bold prediction, but the prediction that you would win, inevitably, the golf that we took part in, and Andy did. I have to say, Andy and Joel, it was very close. Joel had more holes in one than Andy did, and I think I came third or fourth, which I thought was quite admirable. Andy and Joel were quite competitive, actually, when it got to the final count. But it was brilliant fun. If you ever get the chance to do the junkyard golf, if you have it in wherever you live, which is the indoor crazy golf, it's good fun. And so we had a great Christmas do. Then went and sat in a very nice pod on top of a building in the city of London and had a nice meal, which was all really good fun. So I just wanted to give people the ending to that story that we started on the last podcast. Andy did inevitably win yet another ball sport.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, we've mentioned Justin on the show before. Justin is Damien's twin brother. Now, he managed to finish last, and I don't quite know how he managed it, considering Harvey on the last hole took 8 shots to sink her putt, and Justin still finished last, so he hasn't
He finished last, sorry to talk over you, Andy, he finished last by about 4 or 5 shots, I think, and Harvey was flying until that last hole. It's a last hole is a bit of a dodgy one. It's like you either get a hole in one or you get about 10 strokes, and Justin actually did quite well on that hole, but yeah, we've been laughing at Justin ever since then on the in the office. So moving on to what's on the podcast this week, I'm quite excited because it's something slightly different, because this is the last show of the year. And I mean, I say it's the last show. Technically, there will be one released on New Year's Eve, but I don't expect anybody to be listening on New Year's Eve. So that is one that's going to be looking into 2024. So this is the last proper show. And what we've decided to do is look back at some of the best bits of 2023. And the reason we've done that, because I realise you can't listen to every show. I know obviously we have our army of fans that do listen to every show, but there will be people, new listeners, who haven't heard all the best bits of the year. So Andy has compiled a selection of pieces from the podcast, which is why this is a real bumper episode. So it's much longer than normal, but you're going to get some insights on different topics, from investing to financial planning, pensions, and even clearing debt. So I'm going to hand over to Andy so he can explain how this is going to work.
Yeah, so what we'll do is in the show notes, listeners will be able to actually see exactly which podcast we'll be featuring in this highlights episode. And we'll also provide the timestamps for those. So there are going to be some listeners that have heard these before. There are going to be other listeners that haven't heard them. And obviously there are going to be those that are happy and keen to listen again. So we'll provide all of the details of which podcast episodes these are from with the timestamps. And so we're aware that this is a longer episode, and so we've made it nice and easy for you to skip forward and find the pieces that are relevant to you. So the first piece you'll hear is going back to episode 413, where Damien talks about the importance of planning. The next piece you'll hear then is from episode 417, where Damien talks about the personal finance numbers that everyone should know. That's a really interesting piece, and actually when I was researching this and listening back to it, there was actually bits on that I'd picked up that I should have actually remembered and done the first time we did the podcast, and I'm going to be doing that in the new year as part of my new year checklist. Episode 418 is the next one, where Damien does a roundup of the best pension questions that he's been asked. Damien did a bit of a roadshow tour of different podcasts throughout the year, and he was asked a number of questions relating to pensions, so we covered it on that episode. The next one is episode 421, where Damien talks about the importance of overpaying your mortgage ahead of coming up to a remortgage. The next one we look at is a fairly recent one. It's episode 431, where Damien and I talk about the various different investing apps and really how people can start getting into investing. And the final one we're going to focus on was actually just a few weeks ago, where Damien talked about books he'd been reading, and one particular book that talks about the easy way to get out of debt, or the easy way to clear debt.
And before we kick off the show, what I just want to point out is be mindful that these were recorded at different parts of the year. So our content is evergreen, but occasionally I will make contemporary references. We have removed one or two of them, particularly in relation to interest rates and what rates you can get on savings, for example. But do bear that in mind. I will mention one that does come up about annuity rates. Now, of course, annuity rates are still much higher than they were in 2022, but the exact rate I mentioned in one of the podcasts, you've got to be mindful it's not going to be identical now, but it doesn't change the sentiment in any way. Of course, one of the pieces that I really liked is the interest rate cycle. So investing through the rate cycle. And that was recorded in July this year. And what you'll hear is me talking about what types of investments and companies to invest in and types of assets at different stages of the rate cycle. So rate hiking scenarios, when there's a pause, and actually when rates start being cut by the Bank of England and central banks globally. But of course, when this was recorded, we were in a rate hiking cycle. Now we're definitely in the pause cycle and possibly about to enter a rate cutting cycle, which is great because you can listen to the insights I provided back then and compare them to what's happening. And just to give you an insight as well, I talk a lot about when we get to a stage like now, bonds will start doing well and commodities wouldn't. And that's exactly what we've seen since the beginning of November, which of course I love it when something like that happens, when you talk about things, what could happen and what should happen, and when it does come to fruition. And just to reiterate, of course, we are in a period now, rates aren't going up as they were. Mortgage rates are now starting to moderate and actually come down. Now, we do a lot on our YouTube channel, actually, so do watch our YouTube channel because we have produced a number of videos in the last week which are looking at the best mortgages out there, especially the best fixed rate deals and what might happen to interest rates going forward.
Okay, so let's get on with the first highlight from this year then. And so the next piece you're going to hear is the episode where Damien talks about the importance of planning. It comes from episode 413, and then we'll move on into the next pieces that I introduced earlier on in the show. And just to make it easy to understand what piece is what, you'll hear a fireball swoosh noise, and that signifies that that's the end of one piece and you're moving into the next piece. If any doubt, do check out the podcast notes where we put details of all the different pieces that we'll be featuring in this week's episode with the timestamps.
So in recent weeks, I've been doing podcast moonlighting. I know, Andy, it probably upsets you slightly, but each of those times I've been on a podcast, I've been asked questions that relate to my own finances, and I've told stories, anecdotes about what's happened to me in the past, or about how I have coped with certain situations, about when I've had a pension or when I've not contributed to pension. And it is evident that people value that because I am a real person. Like I do worry there are many people who are experts in various fields, including money, who go around and dictate to people and make people feel inferior and failures with money. The reality is there is no perfect solution to money. There is no optimum way to do anything. We're all different. We all have different situations in life, sets of circumstances. And so what's right for one person at a given moment won't be what's right for another person. And one way to think about it is that the way we earn money or acquire it is very personal and idiosyncratic. Then the way that we use it and obtain our goals in life will inevitably be very different. And so what I wanted to do is give some examples about this, and it involves my own personal finances. So on podcast 382, which was way back in, I think, the end of August, beginning of September last year, I talked about planning for your mortgage going up. So we're in a cost of living crisis. We all are. I'm in it. Andy's in it. We all are. And that was before we had the mini budget and the craziness that went on around mortgage rates then, and they started to rocket. I talked about living like it was the winter of 2023 or beyond. So planning for the fact that your mortgage rate would be going up if you had to remortgage in the next year or so. And I talked about setting money aside to build a buffer so you could cope with that. And similarly, we've talked on the podcast about doing the same thing with energy bills. And we've talked about where energy bills might be in the winter of 2023 versus where they were in 2022 and 2021 to give people an idea that they still need to be putting money aside. And that's being prepared. Now, there is famous British Army adage, which I'm not going to say the full 7 Ps because one of them's a swear word and we'd have an explicit rating on this podcast, which would be unfortunate. But the 6P version is proper planning and preparation prevents poor performance. Now, you can kind of apply that to your finances. So going back to that episode, I've been living the last year or so as if it's been the winter of 2023. So I've been putting money aside because I knew my long-term fix on my mortgage was coming up. That is just the situation. It's bad luck in terms of what's going on in the market, but I don't regret any of the decisions I've made financially because they were made for at the time in terms of the products I took out based on my circumstances, the flexibility I needed. So the reality is you can only play what's in front of you. So I've been putting money aside and living like it's the winter of 2023. So I'm going to have to be remortgaging. And the reality is my mortgage is going up significantly. So just to give people some idea, like many of you, my mortgage is probably going to go up about 30%. Now that is a huge amount and it would normally be keeping me awake at night. But what happened is when I started talking on the podcast about preparing, I was doing the same. So I've been putting money aside. Go back and listen to that episode and I talked about it. But essentially, I was looking at where my mortgage could be if things were pretty bad, trying to pull money aside, build a buffer that I could potentially draw upon to offset some of that increase if need be. And it has meant that my wife's had to be on board with all of this, and it does mean that we've had to scale back more than lots of other people. It does baffle me how I just seem to hear everybody's going on holiday this year and doing all these wonderful things. And I'm conscious that obviously my family aren't doing those things, but I was preparing. And of course, our energy bills have gone up, and I'd been preparing for that as well. Now, it is difficult. Not everybody can prepare. Some people have not been able to set money aside, but I've been trying to put aside as much as I can. And what's happened is my mortgage is going to go up significantly, but I've got this buffer, this breather, so that I'm not now staying awake at night. If you'd gone back, say, 3 years ago and told me where I would be in terms of mortgages and energy bills, like most people, you would have been having sleepless nights about these things. But because I'd planned and done exactly what we talked about on the podcast, I've now got this breathing space. And we don't know where mortgage rates are going to go. They could fall in the next couple of years. I mean, that's what the market's predicting. And so then we may have this period where they're higher, but because I'm prepared for that and I'm drawing down on that money that I'd put aside, it means that I can navigate the situation. And in fact, I will be marginally better off than I was last year because I've been saving like crazy. So I don't have to be quite as conscious about that now, because now when I get my mortgage, I know what I'll be paying. So the message is, it's the plan that's important. I can't control what the government does. I can't control what the central banks do. And so by planning, I've managed to build that buffer. Now, there are going to be lots of people who are going to remortgage this year and next year. If you're not already doing that, planning on where your energy bill will be. When we last looked at it, and these may have changed now, it'd probably only be about 10% lower than what it was in the winter of 2022. Mortgage rates, use the repayment calculator that Money to the Masses has online. We'll put a link to it to see what your mortgage rate could be if you are on a fixed and you're about to come off it in the next year or so. So the message is plan. And I feel like Hannibal from the A-Team when I say I love it when the plan comes together. So what my plan does is doesn't control the future, but it's given me a buffer because I planned ahead, a contingency. So please, if you listen to this podcast and you haven't been thinking about that, then do so, because like me, you'll get to the point where I'm not going to be happy about how much I'm paying for my bills like everybody else, but I'm able to sleep at night with it. And then hopefully things will start to come down in the future, but I don't have control of that, but I have a contingency, a plan in place. So it's a bit like having an insurance for the future. And again, insurances are one of those things we talked about on the podcast about that fallback, that plan. One of the things also I want to talk about is that it came to light at the podcast event I did yesterday, and people were talking about not having a pension or how old they were when they started having a pension. Now, throughout my working life, I've been employed by large companies, smaller companies, and companies that don't give benefits. And obviously, I was pre-auto enrollment. I then became self-employed, become a business owner with Money to the Masses. So my journey has been quite convoluted. And so pensions as a priority has changed. Now, auto-enrollment has been fantastic, making people save into pensions. Yes, they can opt out, but realistically, the free money on the table from employers means that I think it's 10 million people are now saving into pensions via auto-enrollment. But any point that I wasn't able to pay into a pension, I might not have had a pension, but I had a plan. And that was a line that I said yesterday at the podcast event. I talked about how at that point in my life that I was saving heavily into ISAs, for example, and they were being earmarked for me, yet for the very long term, but I needed the access potentially to that money just in case. Because of my life at that moment. And my money was still in a tax wrapper. It was still being protected from HMRC. So I was still optimizing returns on my money. But in the future, if I had sufficient earnings and I felt comfortable, I could take the money out of that wrapper, put it into a pension, and assuming I had sufficient earnings, I could get tax relief on that and put it into a pension. So I had a plan. There was a plan, even if somebody looked at what I was doing at that time, because I wasn't employed and because I wasn't benefiting from auto enrollment, and be thinking, you're not paying into a pension at that moment. And they might think that that was something that was a problem or negative. I had a plan. So please, if you listen to this podcast, think about your own finances and what you're doing. Have a plan. Plan what you're going to be doing. Don't leave things to chance. And I do personally worry that a lot of people out there, only because I've heard people say this, is that, oh no, the government will do something, won't they? Because I think people have got used to this notion that the government will bail people out. So we've had the financial crisis and we've had bailouts of banks. I mean, we're still seeing an element of that in America at the moment with the banking crisis. But of course, when the pandemic came, we had furlough. And I've heard somebody actually say to me, yeah, but if we all can't afford our mortgages, then the government will do something. I think that thought process we have to move away from. Do you really want to be reliant on a government that's going to come and bail you out? You need to take responsibility for yourself. So do plan your finances. The other thing that I've been very conscious of is paying down debt. So clearing debt in an environment like this is key. So it means that I'm at a place that can cope if interest rates rise even further, because I'm not paying any more money than I need to on things like debt. And also, if you are thinking about pensions, there are people who maybe put money into investments or pensions, and they always think about, what should I do in a crisis like we are now, cost of living crisis. And I use the analogy of a dimmer switch. You don't have to turn things on and off like a light switch. You can use a dimmer light switch, i.e. turn them down. So yes, auto enrollment at work, you want to be getting your match contributions, so contribute to your workplace pension if you can afford to, so you get those match contributions. But if you are maybe investing in the stocks and shares ISA as well, and you have to turn down your contributions for a while, then that is fine. Try not to turn them off if you can afford it, because turning them back on is always a hurdle. Turning something down and turn it back up again is far easier psychologically than turning something back on once you've turned it off. But then set yourself a plan of when you will increase them again. What triggers will cause you to be able to feel comfortable to pay more into, say, your investments. And go and listen to podcast 281 where I talked about accessing emergency funds. And I think that is important. I did that episode just after the pandemic. It was July 2020, because I think we have to realise if we are in the place where we've built emergency funds, they are there for a reason, and there are times where we need to access them. And I know that can make people feel uncomfortable, but we have to realise that's what they're there for, to give us that flex. And just like other people in this world, I will be accessing money I've put aside. I would love to be sitting there just to ride out this very difficult period that everybody finds themselves in.
I really like that, Damien. A timely reminder that it's good to have a plan, and if nothing else, it helps people to sleep better at night.
And one final point on the plan is don't obsess about it. I think of this like trying to drive from, London to Edinburgh. And I have a plan of how I'm going to get there, that I might use my sat nav or what time I'm going to leave. But traffic and all sorts of things happen along the way. And I always build in enough time, that flexibility. But the planning part will hopefully get me there. But I fully expect it won't quite be executed or go as smoothly as I would hope. That is part of the flexibility element. And the reason I quickly point that out is that the FIRE movement is an extreme version of plans. And while I applaud people who want to do that, I do think that life doesn't quite fit into the neat box that people want it to and follow set rules. And flexibility is always key, but it's better to have a contingency plan that adapts over time. Yeah, so the personal finance numbers you should be aware of. These are numbers that relate to your own finances. And this, again, is inspired by the way I manage my own finances. And I'm aware that I do know these numbers off the top of my head, and it makes life a lot easier. Think of it like an emergency plan. So when you go to work somewhere, they always tell you about the emergency exits, or they tell you what you need to do in the event of a fire. It's that kind of principle. You know these facts because you just don't know what life can throw at you. So I'm going to run through some of these numbers. They cover all areas of your personal finances, and you will see that they are things that you're probably going to go and have to find out. If you know all of these numbers off the top of your head, you're already aware of them, then fair play, you're doing very well with your finances. Some of these are nice to have, some of them are things that I think you really should know. So I'm going to start at the top. Mortgages. Now, mortgages seem to be the big talking point at the moment. We mentioned that on last week's podcast. You should know what interest rate you are paying on your mortgage. You should be able to know that off the top of your head. You should also know what kind of deal you're on. You need to know when it ends. You also need to know whether if it's a fixed rate deal, when the end of that particular deal period. I'm not just talking about the whole mortgage term, when that ends, what age you will be, but also if you're on a fixed deal, when that ends. You know when you need to be looking to remortgage. You also should know what the SVR, the standard variable rate that you will default onto if you don't do anything about remortgaging. So that rate is normally very high. It will be a couple of percent above the average mortgage rate out there. So you should know all of those details. You should know your balance of your mortgage. It doesn't have to be today. It can be each year. You're normally sent a statement that gives you all of this information. And you should also know any early repayment charges on your mortgage if you've got a particular deal in place. Typically, if you've got a fixed rate deal, there will be an early repayment charge if you try to change that mortgage anyway. So, for example, you try to remortgage. Now, the reason you need to know all those pieces is they're very useful if, for example, there was a fundamental change in your life that required you to move, for example, or you might need to remortgage to release some money to be able to help you do something particular. And those details will already allow you to start thinking flexibly around your options. So find out those details if you don't know them. Another useful one, less important, is the overpayment percentage on your mortgage. So how much are you allowed to overpay before you incur or invoke any of those early repayment charges? So that is your mortgage. The next one I would think about is your net and gross pay. So you need to find out what your net and gross pay are if you don't know them. So most people know their gross pay, but do you know what your net pay is and what it should be? Because a lot of people just accept what comes into their bank account. And the reason that I say know your net pay, it helps to ensure you're on the right tax code and you're paying the right amount of tax, particularly if you're employed. So get your pay slip, work out what your net pay is each month, check it against one of the online calculators, the PAYE calculators that exist out there. If you search PAYE calculator on Google, you will find plenty of them and they can tell you what your net pay is, and it should match what's on your pay slip. The other number I think people should know is their hourly rate of pay. Now, you might not get paid hourly, but if you don't, then you can work out what your hourly rate of pay is if you divide your gross pay by 2,000. So if you're on 30,000, then that means that your hourly rate of pay, assuming that you're working sort of 35 to 40 hours a week, is around £15 an hour. The reason I think it's useful is in determining value. So if you go and buy something, you go shopping, for example, then you can determine how many hours of work you will need to accomplish in order to have enough money to buy that item. And that enables you to control your spending somewhat. So that's a really easy number to work out, but incredibly useful. So keeping along the same theme of pay, you should know how many weeks sick pay you get. So check your contract if you're employed so you know what that is. Also find out what your statutory sick pay entitlement is. It will be £109.40. That is statutory sick pay if you're too ill to work up to 28 weeks. We'll put a link in the show notes that explains that in much more detail, but that's just to give you an idea. So the reason you need to know those numbers is because it helps in the event that you might become sick. So people don't think about this, but work out how you're going to survive, which leads nicely onto the next piece about survival funds or emergency funds. Work out what your total bills are. So look at your total bills and then think about the fixed expenditure, that's things like mortgages, or it could be rent, and you think about the income you've got coming in, and then you work out the minimum amount of money you have to earn. So if you had to survive because there was a shock, maybe you lost your job, it could be that you're on long-term sick, what's the minimum amount of money you need coming in to be able to survive? And to do this, you need to therefore work out your discretionary spending. So the things you can cut back on, you need to work out maybe the amount of money you might be putting away for savings and investments. So you could actually cut that back if you had to. You'll come down with this number. You need to know what that number is off the top of your head, and then you work out effectively the surplus you've got. So that's your buffer. Once you know that minimum amount, you can then work on building a cash buffer. So you also need to know how much money you've got in your cash buffer at any given time and how many months that could potentially last you for. I know there's different ways of thinking about cash buffers. Some people use 3 to 6 months gross salary, some people do net pay, some people do bills. But if you know that number, whichever way you do it, that's something you should know off the top of your head. credit score. You should know your credit score. Now, I know there are 3 different agencies out there, that's credit rating agencies, and they all create credit scores in different ways. And I know there is no universal credit score as such, because every time you apply for credit, the lender you're trying to borrow money from will actually make an assessment about your credit worthiness. But if you check your ratings with the agencies, it gives you an idea of your credit worthiness. But more importantly, if you do check that, then you know you are staying on top of your credit report. So if you need to borrow more money for a reason, could be emergency, or you're trying to remortgage, or you're planning on moving, you now know already that you're not going to have a bump in the road or problem. You're already looking at it. So monitor your credit report. It also means that you will be aware if there is fraud occurring, or like identity fraud in particular. So somebody might have stolen your identity and taken out loans in your name. That will show up eventually on your credit report, and it will also impact your credit score. So make sure you know what your credit score is roughly. More importantly, whether it's excellent, good, etc., rather than the actual number. Make sure you know the credit balances on your credit cards. Now, going back to the previous point about budgeting, we'll put a link in the notes of this episode about how you budget, and it will give you links to articles on the website, but it will help you categorize different spending. You can also use budgeting apps. They're very good at helping you manage your money, but they are also useful, not just for the budgeting purposes on spending, but you can use the apps like Plum or Money Dashboard to help you monitor your balances if you've got multiple credit cards, for example. So you should know at any given moment how much money you've got on your credit cards. It will fluctuate as you spend and you pay it back, but also if you've got any loans, you should know what loan values they are, but you also should know the minimum repayments on all of those things, and you should also know the interest rate you're paying, because then you can start to manage them. And sometimes by having these numbers and knowing what they are, it can help galvanize you to make decisions, because you start to realize how much interest you're paying. Then you should also know your overdraft limits as well. If you've got any overdrafts, you should know what they are, because you might need to use them. Hopefully you don't, but you might need to use them. But equally, you should know your credit usage. Now, that's the amount of credit you're using versus the amount you've got available. Now, the conventional wisdoms, if you aim between 15 and 25%, that is a good credit usage for your credit report. So that's going to be positive. If you use 100% of your credit limit, then that will be a negative on your credit report. So if someone was going to lend you money, then they're already seeing that you're maximizing your borrowing. So you need to know what your limits are, but it's also useful to know your liquidity. So by liquidity, I mean how much money could you access if you need to. Now, that could include things like savings that you've got in the bank. Think of it, I mean, we talked about in the office, and it's probably not the nicest way to describe it, but it helps visualize it. It's almost the fund that if you had, you're watching one of these Hollywood films and you've got a ransom demand, what sort of money could you get hold of quickly without penalty? And that includes savings, investments, that could include things like credit. And that number, that liquidity number, is quite useful to know, because if there is an emergency, something went wrong, do you have access to funds in the short term? So you don't really want to access them, but it's useful to know that if something went wrong, it's all about flexibility. So I know this number in my head. I know that if something went wrong and the car broke down, how much could I get hold of very quickly to fix a problem that I've got? And you want to keep that number at a decent level. So that's why you have cash buffers and savings. Moving on to pensions, you should know what your state pension age is. It was different for different people. For me, it's going to be age 68. You need to know what your state pension age is. I mean, most people will be 68, but if you want to check, because it does change, you can go on a calculator online and put in your date of birth, and it'll tell you what your state pension age is. We'll put that in the notes of this particular episode. You should know what your desired pension age is. So when do you want to retire? So when do you want to access your personal pensions? You need to know your employer and employee contribution rates if you're contributing to a pension at work, because it's useful to know your percentage contributions into your pensions. There's a rule of thumb that's out there. You shouldn't rely on it, but if you use your age and you haven't started a pension, then they use a rule of thumb that if you take your age and divide it by 2, that's roughly the percentage of your earnings you should be putting into pensions each month. So that means if you're aged 40 and you haven't started contributing, you need to be putting about 20% of your earnings into a pension each month. So that is a rule of thumb, but you can see if you know those numbers, you know how much you're contributing. The other thing you need to know is, you know, when you want to retire, you need to know what your retirement income is likely to be. So we'll put a link in the notes to calculators that can help you. If you know how much is in each of your pensions, you know what type of pensions they are, and you know the date you want to retire and the amount you're putting in each month, you can work out what your retirement income is likely to be. Now, there is always going to be variations in that. There's different factors you can change in terms of investment assumptions, but these calculators are quite useful. We'll put one in the notes of this video. You should know roughly what your retirement income is going to be and what your retirement might look like. It would also help you to know the percentage return that you're planning on achieving in order to get to where you want to be. And the reason I like to know that number is because in years when markets rally and you get them go up, say 20%, but you get years when they fall 20%, you'll stick to your plan. As long as your long-term annual rate of return is still above what you need to achieve your goal, whether it's retirement or whatever you're saving and investing for, then you know you're on track and it stops knee-jerk decisions being made. So make sure you know those details about your pensions. Interestingly, we've created an investment calculator at Money Masses that can help you with working out your percentage you need to achieve your goals in the long run. So we'll put a link to that in the notes, because this is all about telling people what numbers they need to know and how they find them out as well. The investments, I think you should know how much you've got in investments. This counts for pensions as well. What are your charges per year? So taking into account all charges you pay, whether it's for financial advice, whether it's for platform fees, the underlying funds, you should know the percentage number that you're being charged each year. Most people find that hard to work out, but if you go on your platform of choice, you should be able to see what you're being charged on each part of your investments, whether that's the platform or the fund. Moving on to the savings rate. You don't need to know this, but I quite like this idea. It goes back to the pension contributions idea. What is your savings rate? So how much are you putting away for your future, whether it is just directly into savings, whether it's into pensions and investments? How much of that is being put into your investments, savings and pensions versus what you take home? So you basically work out how much you're putting away and you divide it by your monthly take home pay, and that will give you your savings rate. You should roughly know what that is. And if it's above 10%, then that's good. If it's not, then you probably want to try and get it up as high as you can. Again, you can use that age idea I said on pensions. You can apply it across the board to pension, savings and investments. Of course, with savings, you need to know what your interest rate is that you're receiving, because you might be being underpaid. You might be better off shopping around. The last ones I'm going to focus on are related to your house. We've done mortgages, but you should know how much equity you've got in your house. You should know what your house is roughly worth. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're not moving, but at least you know what your options are when it comes to remortgaging, because you'll need to know what your loan to value is. And I think that ties in nicely. If you take everything I've talked about, you should know what your net wealth is.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. And Damien, you've been out and about doing a number of live events in recent months. And so you're just going to quickly go through some of those topics that you've covered for the podcast listeners.
Yeah, so I know that not everybody can get to these live events. If you can, it's fantastic to meet people at them. But I thought it'd be useful actually to go through the questions, because in every one of these live events, we have periods where the audience can interact and ask questions, which I always find really exciting. I like that interaction. So I'm going to go through some of the things that have come up in these events that I think people will find useful, because I obviously see people when they start scribbling down notes. So if you're scribbling down notes, I'm thinking, well, what I've just told them, they've obviously found that very useful. So I'm going to go through some of these bits and pieces now. One of the things that came up on a recent show that I did was about the amount of money you need for retirement, so a decent standard of living. And I think we touched upon this quite some time ago, a couple of years ago on the podcast. Now, I know that all of you who listen go back and listen to all of our episodes, but just for the one or two of you that don't go back and listen to every single episode, here are some numbers. So the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association did some research, and they looked at the amount of income single people and couples would need for different types of lifestyle and retirement. So for a relatively minimum lifestyle, a sort of minimalist one in retirement, a single person needs £10,200 a year. A couple, that increases to £15,700. For a moderate lifestyle, then that is £20,200 for a single person, and for a couple it's £29,100. Now, if you want a comfortable lifestyle in retirement, then a single person needs £33,000 a year, and a couple needs £47,500. So those numbers are useful if you want a finger in the air, very broad numbers that you might want to work towards. And of course, this gets back to the next topic that often comes up, and it's to do with withdrawal rates from a defined contribution pension. So let's imagine you get to retirement, you have a defined contribution pension. So that's the one where you're paying in money every month, hopefully, and it builds up over time. Now, what is a sustainable rate to withdraw money from that? Now, the 4% rule that's out there is broadly based upon a mixed portfolio of assets, broadly 50% bonds, 50% equities. And if you drew money down from that, once you got to 65, at a rate of 4% per annum, so you took 4% of the portfolio value every year, then that would be seen as a sustainable rate at which you wouldn't run out of money in retirement. Now, I have paraphrased that somewhat. If you go to podcast episode 210, we did a piece on debunking the 4% rule. And I've listened to that again, and in that show, to give you the highlight, the 4% is very dependent on how your money's invested and your own circumstances, including when you retire. And broadly speaking, a more realistic rate is somewhere between 1.8 and 3%. Now, the point is that we all need to look and go for a conservative approach when we're looking at withdrawal rates. But 4% has been the conventional number for a while. So it's going to be very dependent on your own lifestyle, how much you want to spend in retirement. Now, what people have forgotten about is annuities. So annuities are coming back into fashion when it comes to retirement planning, because if you go back to early 2022, you could get an annuity of about 3.5%, I think it was, for a 65-year-old. And the rate you get on an annuity depends on the annuity itself, whether you have guaranteed periods and different things. But I'm just giving you a broad idea. Since gilt yields have rallied significantly in the last year, and that's because of the high interest rate environment that we're in. Now, what we've got is that annuity rates are up nearer 7, and you can get even more than that, obviously, if you're older than 65, but also if you have a health issue of some kind. So that is a significant difference. 7%, that means if you have a £100,000 pension pot, you could get 7%, that's £7,000 a year in income for life until you die. That is why people are looking at annuities. Don't forget that when you have a pension pot, you can take UF+, you can take the lump sums out of it. And I'm not going to get into the details of how that's taxed. I'll put links in the notes of this show where people can find more details. You can use drawdown, so you can move some of your money into drawdown to provide an income and take some tax-free cash. But you can obviously buy annuities, or you can do a combination of all of those. So there is a podcast, episode 348, where I talk about when to buy an annuity. A very interesting piece on that show, which talked about the age that was the optimum time to buy an annuity, and the optimum was based upon soft facts as well, not just mathematics. It was based upon when people deemed them to be better value and whether people wanted to pass money on to their next of kin, etc. What were their priorities? So the other thing you need to think about is what your retirement's going to look like. And everybody asks me at these shows, how do I go about doing that? Well, there's pension calculators, which we link to in the notes of this show, and you can use those to put in how much money you've got in your pension, how much you're going to contribute, and see how much income you can get in your retirement. Now, what I would also suggest people do is go and think about what they want their retirement to be. I often find that people glaze over when you say that to them, because it's very hard to visualize what a good retirement would look like. So what I do is often say to people in these shows is think about what you want it not to be, and then work back from there. And so you know what you don't want your retirement to be like, and you keep going until it gets towards something that you do want it to be. And you will have probably scaled back lots of things in terms of unnecessary stuff that you thought you would want, and focus on the things that really are important. Then you can work out how much that will cost a year, and then you can start to play with the calculators to work out how much you need to put in, but also work out that return on investment, that annual rate of return that you'll need in order to try and get towards the goals that you want with the money you've got available at your disposal, including the money that's in your pension pot already, but also the contributions you could potentially make. And hopefully that annual rate of return is realistic. If not, then you need to dial down what your retirement dream is to make it more realistic. The key thing is you need to have conversations about money with your partner, for example, if you're getting into your mid-50s, and thinking about what retirement might look like and when you can actually retire. One of the things that always comes up is about auto-enrollment, and explain to people how it's free money. So if you enroll into your company pension scheme, you put 5%, your employer has to put 3%, but also don't forget you get the government tax relief as well. So there is free money there. So always, if you can afford it, join your company's auto-enrollment scheme, and hopefully your employer matches your contributions, so you at least got 5 and 5. People ask, how much should you put into your pension each month? I mean, again, it depends on your circumstance. There is that rule of thumb, half your age. So you take your age, divide it down by 2. That's a broad percentage of your income you should be putting in. So if you're 40, it's 20% of your income. That is a very broad number. I did point out to people about the importance of starting early in the show yesterday that I did. So give you an example, if you're age 25 and you put in £100 a month into your pension, your employer matches that, and you're lucky enough to get that match, and you have an assumed growth rate of around 7 or 8% per annum, you decide to retire when you're 65, then the power of compounding means that you would have around about £500,000 in your pension by the time you're 65. That's 40 years. Now, I've not assumed you've increased your contributions in any way, so you're not paying more than £100 a month, but it shows you the power of compounding. You've only put in just under £100,000 into that pension pot. The difference is, if you had waited, say you were 45, and you then decide to do the same thing and think, I need to start saving for my pension, I need to put in the money, so I've got the same amount as the guy who was 25 who started, so I want to have $500,000 in my pension pot by the time I'm 65. The amount you've got to put in each month is not twice theirs, because you might think in your head, logically, they're doing it for 40 years, I'm going to be doing it for 20, I've got to put in at least twice. The answer is you have to put in 5 times as much as they are. So you're going to have to put in £1,000. So £500 from you, for example, maybe £500 a month from your employer. So that shows you the cost of delaying starting your pension. Now, there are obviously people who we talk to at these shows, and I'm very conscious that you always tell people to start early. What about most people who started too late? Now, I always talk about unconventional retirement. We are approaching a world where I don't think retirement's going to be quite like it used to be. I always talk about the idea that if you started a pension late in life, then you could try to build a huge pot by aggressively putting money aside. That is one way of doing it. But when you've got a very limited amount of time, yes, you'll benefit from the tax relief from the pension contributions. But if you, for example, built £100,000 pension pot, then even at today's annuity rates, that will give you about £7,000 a year, roughly. So let's assume that you could even do something like that with drawdown. If instead, as you are later in life, you use your contact book and you use your knowledge and your experience and expertise, and perhaps you've got a hobby or a passion and started following that, and you only have to generate £580 extra a month from that hobby eventually by the time you retire, that would be the equivalent of £7,000 a year. So that is doing something you love and making it generate potentially some income. You haven't had to put away £100,000 pension pot to generate that £7,000. You're just doing something that you love, and you've over time managed to get it to a point that it can generate that amount of money. It might take you 10 years to get to that point. What I want to do is just give people some light at the end of the tunnel. And I always, when I talk about this at events, I can see some people's faces light up a bit, because it is a little bit depressing when people just tell you you've got to keep putting money in your pension pot and it's too late for you. Well, there are other things that you can do. There are obviously people out there who want to try and put as much money in their pension as possible. Then you can use carry forward rules, where if you've maxed out the amount you can put into a pension this year, so that's £60,000, you can carry forward the last 3 years unused allowances. So if you've not used them, you can bring them forward. There are rules around them. We'll put a link in the notes of the podcast to it. The one thing I would say, if you're planning to not contribute to your pension at the moment, let's say you're a freelancer and think, well, in a few years I'll really ramp up when I've got going and I'll put money in my pension. You do need to have been in a pension. You have to have a pension that's open at the point that you want to carry forward from. You can't decide, oh, I want to open a pension today. You've not had a pension before and you're going to use the carry forward rules and use the unused allowances from previous years. You can't do that. So you will need to open a pension now if you want to take advantage of those rules. Another podcast that's worth drawing people's attention to is episode 372, which is about retirement spending truths. That was an episode where we talked about how your spending habits can change through retirement. So there are lots of assumptions that people make about how much money they will need or how that will vary. And in that episode, we talked about some research that shows that the amount of spending goes up by about 1% a year after inflation. So take inflation out of the equation, then your amount you're going to spend creeps up slightly until you're about age 80, then it starts to drop down. But more importantly, the stuff you spend money on changes. So it's holidays ultimately and things like that, the sort of golden period of retirement for a lot of people. And then later on, they spend more money on things like services. So that would be people perhaps who come in and help cook, clean, or do the gardening. So that's an interesting episode to listen to, because I think it will give people a realistic assessment of what retirement might look like and what they should plan for. One of the other topics is freelancers. We get a lot of freelancers at these events, probably because they can turn up and not have to ask for time off work. But questions about freelancers and pension contributions are popular because obviously they don't benefit from auto enrollment. But the key thing is, the message always has been, make sure you are putting money aside. Now, some people who are freelancers might put money aside in a separate pot, not put it into their pension until the end of the tax year, for example. But ultimately, they're still trying to make those pension contributions. And of course, it does reduce your tax bill. Now, people who are directors of businesses, they shouldn't forget about their own pensions. Often they'll worry about their employees because of auto enrollment, but forget their own pensions. I talked a fair bit about that last night when I was doing the live show. But one thing is, it pays to put a small amount aside each month into a pension. And of course, the company can do that directly, which is tax efficient rather than you taking the money out and putting it into a pension. Again, there is the maximum limit you can put in each year, which remains the same. So at the moment, it's £60,000, but you don't have the reference to income. So it doesn't matter about your actual earnings. Whereas for personal contributions, obviously it's the lower of your personal earnings and that annual allowance which you can put in to a pension yourself. So that is an interesting piece. I mean, I could go on all day, but other things people often ask about the state pension. Do make sure you know your state retirement age. It does differ from person to person. Go and look at the state retirement age calculators that you can find online. We're always asked about, will the state pension still be around when they reach retirement? It's a difficult thing to say, but of course, politically, it wouldn't be the easiest thing to get rid of. But when planning for retirement, do think about the numbers with or without the state pension in there, so you can see that what would happen if the state pension is removed. Because if you can plan for retirement and have enough money without needing the state pension, then the state pension is a Brucey bonus. And of course, I know that is a best case scenario. A lot of people won't ever be in that position. A couple of last things. I'm often asked about how they invest their pension and the assets and about the risk tolerance, and lots of people don't seem to be able to work out their own risk profile. So obviously a lot of these robo-advice propositions have tools that will do that for you, but you can go to myrisktolerance.com, which is a website that the back end of it is run by Finametrica, and it's the basis of which a lot of financial advisors assess clients' attitudes to risk. You can pay for one-off assessment, so that's something worth bearing in mind. And I'm always asked about financial advice. At retirement, it is the time when financial advice is really valuable because it can stop you making mistakes. There are lots of different options that you have when it comes to taking your income. I mean, I talked about earlier mixing annuities with drawdown, but also the way you manage the portfolio so it can last for retirement. Rather than investing for growth and taking chunks, you can invest for income. And so you could build a portfolio of, say, income funds that produce a natural dividend over time. That is something that a financial advisor could help you with. And if you don't have one you can trust, then go and look at a website called vouchedfor.co.uk, which is like the TripAdvisor of financial advisors. And they'll have customer reviews on there, and you can find one near you that offers the services that you require. And more importantly, make sure you talk to a number of financial advisors if you're going to use them, because you can compare their services, but also their fees. So what I wanted to talk about is overpaying your mortgage in a high interest rate environment. Now, ultimately, if your mortgage is higher than the rate you get on savings, then the conventional wisdom is that it pays to overpay your mortgage. It makes financial sense. That's because you pay less interest in the long run, and you actually can reduce the number of years it takes to pay off your mortgage. We looked at this in detail on episode 219 of this podcast. So we're going to link to that in the notes of this show. Listen to that show because we talk about the things to consider before you repay your mortgage. I don't want to dwell on that on this show, but as a summary, if you're thinking about overpaying your mortgage, you need to make sure that you have a cash buffer in place first for any emergencies, but you should also pay off any high interest debt that you have before you think about overpaying your mortgage. Also, check for early repayment charges that may be in your contract. You don't want to incur those. And also stay within any limits that you have on overpayment. So a lot of mortgages will have a 10% limit. So 10% that might be outstanding on your mortgage at the start of the year, for example, you're allowed to pay that off without incurring any early repayment charges. So a typical question that I'm getting from people is that they might be in a fixed mortgage that may have been a 5-year fix. They may have 2 to 3 years left to run before they have to remortgage. Are they better off now overpaying that mortgage ahead of them remortgaging in, say, 2 years' time? So if you've been listening to this show, I've been talking a lot about this scenario, preparing for rates going up when you come to remortgage. And I've been doing that myself, and I've actually been putting money aside. That's one potential solution that you have. But I want to explore this overpaying idea in an environment that we've got now, because we've always talked about high interest rate environments. Then it does pay to overpay your mortgage. It does make sense. We're in one of those now, or you're going to be heading into one of those environments when you come to remortgage if you're still on a low rate. If you overpay your mortgage, then what it can do is give you a better loan to value. So if you're on the cusp of a loan to value threshold, so typically lenders will look at thresholds of 90%, 80%, 75%, 60% loan to value. And depending on which band you land, then you can get a better rate. The lower your loan to value, the better rate you typically get. So let's say, for example, on a 2-year fix right now, you'll get about 5.64% if you've got a 90% loan to value. If you can drop down to 80% loan to value, you can get 5.34%. If you get a 75% loan to value, you get 5.29%. A 60% loan to value, you get 5.27%. So obviously rates change regularly. That is just the rate I'm giving you as of today. So you can see that by overpaying your mortgage, you could actually get a better loan to value, which means that you will be paying less a month on your monthly repayments. So that is obviously attractive. Now, you can obviously overpay your mortgage within certain limits without incurring an early repayment charge. I mentioned earlier on a typical 10% of the amount that's owed at a given point, let's say the 1st of January, without having to pay that early repayment charge on your mortgage. So look at your terms and conditions. It's going to be specific to your mortgage what you can overpay. If you do overpay, then obviously, like I said, you can reduce the length of your loan, so reduce the term, you pay it back sooner, and it will reduce the amount of interest in the long run. So logically, overpaying your mortgage does make sense. One thing to bear in mind, if you do overpay, then often you won't be able to get the money back from the lender. It used to be the case there were mortgages around that were more widespread. Nationwide used to have a product where if you overpaid on a mortgage, you could actually borrow it back again. And I only know this is Nationwide because I actually had one of those mortgages in the past, and they were one of the few lenders that actually had that option. Now, while most lenders won't allow you to borrow money back that you've overpaid, there are some lenders, Virgin have a range, for example, of fully flexible mortgages. And if you look at the T's and C's on those, they have options that include overpaying, underpaying, borrowing back money that you've overpaid. So if you've got one of those products, check. You may have more options when it comes to overpaying that will influence your decision on whether you want to or not. There are some lenders that do offer the ability to underpay if you've overpaid in the past. That's something to bear in mind, but you've got to talk to your lender and actually work out the impact for you, because you want to make sure there's not going to have any impact on your credit file, for example. Although, as we mentioned on last week's podcast, the government has put pressure on lenders to allow people to temporarily make changes to their mortgage, so increase the term or reduce their payments by going on to interest only, for example, without it impacting their credit file. The one thing I will throw out there, that charter, as it's called, has actually only been signed by most lenders, but it only covers 85% of the mortgage market. But you can look at a list of the people that have signed that charter. So it might not include your lender, but you want to have a look at that. We'll put a link in the notes of this show so you can have a read through. So one tip, if you are going to overpay, make sure you tell your lender that you want the overpayments to reduce the term of the mortgage rather than just reducing the amount you're going to be paying going forward each month. So there you go. That's overpaying. And as I said, you can go listen to that past podcast, and we have got links to articles in the notes of this particular show. So we'll put aside the long-term benefits of overpaying. There are people out there who are raising the question in relation to what's going to happen in a couple of years' time when they come to remortgage. Is overpaying worthwhile? So I've run through some numbers for you just to give an illustration. And these numbers are based on a £200,000 mortgage over a 30-year term. So it's going to be different for individuals. But if, for example, you are on a low mortgage rate because you fixed maybe for 5 years with a 1.2% interest, so you've got a lot of equity in your house, you had a good loan to value when you took out that mortgage originally, that would mean that your monthly mortgage repayments were about £660 a month. So in a couple of years' time, let's say 2 years' time, you're going to have to remortgage. And let's say you're going to go onto another fixed rate deal and you're concerned that your rates are going to jump. So let's use the current rates that you can get, 4.7%. The Bank of England said this week that rates were going to be higher for longer in terms of the base rate. If that's the case, then let's assume mortgage rates are going to be about that level in 2 years' time when you come to remortgage. Now, if that's the case, when you come to remortgage and you were getting 4.7% for your interest rate on that new mortgage, you would be paying £1,010 a month compared to the £660 a month that you're paying now. That is a £350 a month difference. So that might be quite a bit. Let's say, for example, you at the moment have £200 a month spare that you could put away towards your mortgage. So you could overpay your mortgage at this point in time to try and bring it down because you want to reduce your loan so your monthly repayments are lower when you come to remortgage in 2 years' time. I worked out the impact of that with a number of different calculators, which we will include in the notes of the show. If you do that, and let's assume rates are still where they are now, they've not gone higher or lower, 4.7%, then your monthly repayment after all that effort will reduce to £985 from that £1,010 number. That means there's going to be a £25 difference after all that effort. So you will have overpaid by £4,800 over that 2-year period, and the net result when you come to remortgage will be that you will have a lower monthly repayment of £25 a month. Assuming you don't increase the term, which will be an option for some people looking to reduce their monthly repayment, but it will cost you more in interest in the long run if you do that. Now, if instead you put that £200 a month in a savings account, that would mean that by the end of the term, you'd have £4,800 in a savings account. So over the next 2 years, £4,800 plus some interest that you're likely to get. Don't forget, you can get some decent rates on interest now. You can get more than 7% in some cases on regular savings. So you would then have that amount of money sitting there. What you could do is, if you're worried about your mortgage going forward and you want flexibility, you could, in theory, get to that remortgage date in 2 years' time. Your new mortgage will be that £1,010 that I mentioned, but you could then take £200 a month out of your savings pot automatically to subsidise your monthly mortgage payments. What that would mean is, rather than pay £1,010 a month, you'll be paying £810 a month. Now, that is a significant difference, but it means that you'll only be paying £150 more than what you currently are on your cheap deal. So that $660 a month, your mortgage will effectively in 2 years' time rise to £810 a month, which is different to the £1,010 it could be. But all along, all you've been paying is £200 more a month because you've been putting that in the savings account. So okay, your $660 that you're paying now, you'll be paying $860 a month for the next 2 years, but you will then be paying £810 for 2 years if you fix for 2 years. So that means that you will feel like your mortgage has actually fallen by £50 a month in 2 years' time. Now, of course, this is a short-term flexible plan that might help you. And in 2 years after the next remortgage, so in 4 years' time, you're going to have to remortgage and it could be a very different world and you're kind of putting the pain off. But what this is doing is helping you cope with a new world of rising interest rates by subsidising it over time. And this is effectively the plan that I talked about on the podcast last year that I put in place to help me moving forward with higher interest rates on my mortgage. And you can see what you're doing is increasing your mortgage payments, living in a world that is reflective of a higher interest rate world now, but by doing so, you're softening the pain in the future. So in 4 years' time, you might be hoping that rates will come back down again and then your mortgage will start to fall. Yes, overpaying is the best strategy long term, because you're reducing your debt in a high interest rate world. But what I'm doing here is giving people another idea option where they could potentially ease the short-term burden and pain that they might go through in 2 years' time. Ultimately, overpaying your mortgage works best over the long term, and if the amount that you are overpaying is significant. So it's not a short-term strategy, but a long-term strategy. And even if you do save up money into a savings account, don't forget you can also use that lump sum at the end if you wanted to reduce the amount of mortgage that you will need to borrow when you come to remortgage. So you will have a lower loan to value and therefore potentially get a better rate on your mortgage. mortgage. But one thing you'll notice, I've not talked about offset mortgages today. This piece has been on the assumption that people are paying out of their regular monthly income. So they haven't got large sums saved up. Offset mortgages, of course, work best when you have significant sums of money that can be put in a savings account alongside an offset mortgage. So you offset that interest that's being paid at a high level. But that is a topic for another day.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. We're going to be talking about investing across the interest rate cycle. What have we got on this, Damien?
So this was born out of the observation that if you look at markets in 2023, so we're talking about equity markets in particular, the markets where the investors think that the respective central bank is nearing the end of its rate hikes, those markets have tended to do better. So that means the US stock market, particularly tech stocks, but the UK has lagged because that is a market where people are seeing increased rate hikes and the expectation of further aggressive rate hikes are there, more so than we are expecting in the US. So you're seeing that the FTSE 100, for example, is lagging things like US equities. And so that comparison between expectations of where interest rates are likely to be in different markets, that divergence between monetary policy of different central banks is quite telling. Now, if we are closer to the peak of UK base rates than we were, say, 6 months ago, which we presumably must be, then the performance of markets is probably going to change as we start to go into a world of maybe a pause in base rate hikes or they being cut. And if that's the case, and we think we're closer to that peak rate and therefore a change, a pivot, then could we preempt that and change our portfolios to benefit for a world where there is a pause in rate hikes following a whole series of aggressive rate hikes like we've seen, or potentially when they're cut? So what I did is look at how markets have behaved in past interest rate cycles. So where we've had hikes, pauses and cuts in the base rate in the UK. Now, you've got to bear in mind that the base rate in the UK is not the only factor that influences investment markets around the world. There's a whole host of them. You can just think recently you had the pandemic, you had the dot-com bubble bursting, you had the Ukraine war. There's going to be lots of things and moving parts that impact what happens to investment markets. And also you've got other central bank policy going on as well. But in the UK, don't forget the base rate when it moves has a significant impact on our economy, on inflation. It also has a big impact on currency moves. So normally when the base rate goes up, it starts to have a positive influence on sterling versus other currencies. Not always, but typically it would do. And of course, that then has an impact on the performance of assets that we invest in abroad. Because don't forget that if you buy something abroad, you've got to convert it back to UK currency, so the pound, and therefore that has an impact. If you buy something in the US, and it's in US dollars, whether it's shares or other assets, if you then convert that back to pounds, but the pound has rallied, then the value of your investments can actually theoretically go down, even if the asset itself, the price in dollar terms, hasn't fallen. So it has to take all that into account. So what I did for 80/20 investor members was look at the period in particular from the mid-90s up until today. And we had a couple of periods where interest rates were hiked, where they were pulled back, they were cut, and where we had a pause. So I looked at how markets performed in each of those phases and then even worked out the annualized performance of different asset classes. And the way I did that is I looked at the performance of different unit trust sectors that exist. So that includes things like commodities, North American equities, UK equities, different types of bonds, so global bonds, for example, or UK corporate bonds or UK gilts. And by looking at all these different asset classes, you could see, is there a pattern? And there are some patterns amongst them. Of course, I can't give it all away on the podcast, but I'm going to give you some of the edited highlights. So during periods where there are aggressive rate hikes, some of the assets that have tended to outperform have been commodities. So over the 5 periods that I identified where rates were hiked aggressively, then commodities had an annualized return of nearly 18%. So the performance was strong. And if we think about why could that be, now, one of the reasons could be because if the pound rallies, because interest rates have been increased, then if the pound moves higher versus the dollar, then that will mean the US dollar index falls. So a measure of the strength of the dollar, it weakens. And when the dollar weakens, that's good for commodities because most commodities are actually priced in dollars. So that is one reason. But also, if we are in a rate hiking cycle, it could be because the economy is booming. in danger of overheating, in fact. So if that's the case, then it could be that the commodities are in demand. But another thing is that if inflation is high, and that is one of the reasons why the Bank of England may be hiking rates in these periods, then commodities are a good hedge against inflation. And we saw that to a certain point last year in 2022. And that might explain why commodities did quite well. Other assets that tended to do quite well were infrastructure funds. Now, they're funds that tend to include assets that are inflation protected. It could be things like toll roads. It could be certain kinds of construction, energy projects, things that often have inflation linked revenue streams. So they tended to perform quite well. The things that did badly were almost exclusively bonds. So if you looked at global bonds, UK corporate bonds, they tended to do particularly badly, and also gilts. So UK gilts were one of the worst performing sectors alongside global bonds, and that will be for two reasons. Gilts, they have a high sensitivity to interest rate movements. It's called duration. And so when interest rates go up aggressively, it means that the value of those gilts falls more aggressively than, say, other bonds with lower duration. And in terms of global bonds, it's probably partly because, yes, bonds do badly in a high interest rate environment, but because of the strengthening of the pound, it would mean that that currency conversion would actually be to the detriment of any global bonds that you had. So they were some sectors that did well and badly during that environment. So I'm not going to dwell on any others, but that gives you some insight. Now, the other place that did quite well was UK smaller companies. And I think part of that reason that UK smaller companies funds outperformed, say, the larger cap funds that were out there, so I mean large UK companies, so things like in the FTSE 100, is probably because when interest rates were rising, the pound probably rose too. That would mean that import costs, things they imported, would fall because the pound would buy more things from abroad. And also the economy was probably quite buoyant, like I said before, would be in danger of overheating. That's typically across these different periods. So don't forget, smaller companies are more domestically focused, so their valuations are influenced by the health of the UK economy. Now, the one period where that wasn't true was last year, and that was probably because inflation was the overriding reason why the Bank of England was actually raising rates. It wasn't because the economy was booming, it was because of inflation. And if inflation is getting out of control, then it can be for the smaller companies out there that rate hikes start to impact them more aggressively because their cost of their borrowings goes up, but also they might find it more difficult to pass the additional costs onto their customers than, say, large companies do. So we've seen supermarket prices go up, but more local companies, smaller companies perhaps, find it more difficult to pass on the rising costs onto their customers. So that is an interesting dynamic. If we want to look at the periods where rates pause, so let's say we have an aggressive hiking cycle that we've had, but then rates don't immediately fall. They sit higher for longer, like the Bank of England has suggested this week they might do. What happens then? Well, commodity prices tend to do quite well. Again, that's probably because the economy is still going okay because they haven't had to cut rates aggressively to try and stimulate it, but also they continue to be an inflation hedge. So inflation might be proving sticky. So commodities tend to do quite well, but also financial stocks. And it's interesting that they do at this point perform better than they did during the rate hiking cycle. What happens during the rate hiking cycle is that as interest rates go up, banks, as we now know, if you look around you, the cost of mortgages is going up, the cost of loans is going up, the interest rates they charge, but the amount of money you're getting on your savings isn't going up as aggressively. The margins, the profit margins at banks are increasing. And you've seen people criticize banks in the last couple of weeks for this fact. So on the way up, the margins are increasing, but when they're at their peaks, you've paused, that's when their profit margins are probably at their widest. So they haven't had to increase interest rates for savers, but they've taken the full profit that's been enabled by raising the interest rates on their loans and mortgages, for example. So the annualized return for financials was about 30%. It's significant when we went through a pause period. Another type of asset that does quite well are property funds. So I think property benefits from people thinking, right, interest rate hikes aren't going to continue. And if they don't continue, then hopefully that will be good news for people wanting to invest in property. Now, in terms of what happens when rates start going down, I'm not dwelling on all the details I've said. You need to look at the heat maps yourself. Now, this seems to be a damage limitation exercise because bonds do well, global bonds do well. It's the counter to what we saw before because you get the currency kick now because if interest rates are being cut, probably the pound is falling in value against other currencies. So that means that you get a currency boost on any assets you own abroad. So your bonds that are getting a benefit from rates being cut, you're going to get that currency kicker for global bonds. And lo and behold, which asset also does particularly well in a world of falling interest rates? Well, if you listen to the earlier part, you'll know that will be UK gilts, because they get the flip side of the movement in interest rates. This is positive for them. Now, the damage limitation part is that equity markets tend to do pretty badly. Now, you would sit there and think when we see interest rates go down that, yeah, it often in the short term is a boost to equity markets. But when you get aggressive rate cuts, it turns out that the impact on markets is negative, because there is normally something going on in the background. There's a black swan, maybe like the financial crisis or the dot-com bubble bursting, or there is some economic disaster unfolding that's caused them to cut interest rates, and therefore that will mean that people become risk averse and they start selling out of equities. But also those valuations of those equities will probably be overstressed, because the earnings will start to fall, so people don't want to pay as much for them, so people start selling out and they move into safer assets like bonds. But one of the areas that does quite well as well relatively is cash. And the reason cash starts to perform is because you can lock in at the point where we've been at elevated levels of interest rates. But if you've locked in at that point and rates start to fall, then when other things start to tumble, your high interest rate that you've locked into then looks very attractive and will be one of the stronger assets. So eventually, obviously, once we get back into that cycle again where rates are falling and we start to get back into perhaps a lull period that we had in the last decade or so where rates are low, the value of cash is eroded by inflation during those periods. So you can see that every type of asset tends to have its day, and throughout that cycle of rates going up, rates pausing and rates falling, sometimes you don't get the pause, they just go up and down quite aggressively. You can see there'll be a pivot and a change. So if we do get this pivot, this change, then what it means is we could see some significant differences or changes in performance of assets going forward. So what we see during this part of the year may be quite different towards maybe the beginning of next year when the base rate goes on hold, if the market's predictions are correct, or potentially starts to fall as we go to next year. But of course, if you want to find out more, you can take out a trial of 80/20 Investor. But this kind of investment cycle, investing for a cycle, will give you a overriding direction of where assets might be heading that you can apply to a portfolio if you analyze it. But in the shorter term, there will be macro events that override all of this stuff. So you get things like the Ukraine war, pandemic, like I mentioned. But it is interesting to see that as we shift from one regime to another, that we may see a big change in how parts of our portfolio start to perform, and potentially bonds could start to have their day again.
Okay, so just before we move on then, Damien, I'm particularly focusing on commodities and also UK smaller companies, because you focused on that in a lot of your research. Do they behave differently on the way up and on the way down? What's the sort of insight into that?
Yeah, sometimes assets don't form in direct opposites in different cycles. There's a little bit of mixed performance, but they're an example. On the way down, commodities tend to, not always, because it depends on the macro stuff, as I mentioned. On the way down, they tend to underperform and actually will lose money. And part of the reason is probably because like a black swan event will happen, and the reason they're cutting rates is to stimulate economic growth. And if the Bank of England's doing it, it probably means that other central banks are doing it because there's some global economic crisis. And if there's a global economic crisis, that means there isn't a demand for commodities for people to build stuff, so commodities fall. And on smaller companies are domestically focused. So they tend to be those companies where their customers are in the UK, whereas you get the all companies sector, so things in the FTSE 100, a lot of their customers and income comes from abroad. So UK smaller companies are influenced by the economics of what's going on in the UK. So again, if the Bank of England is cutting interest rates to stimulate economic growth, that means probably the economy is slumping and is in a contraction, and probably we are in a recession. And so therefore that will be bad for companies that are based in the UK who service customers in the UK. So UK smaller companies will be one of the worst places to be during that aggressive cutting cycle. But then we come out the other side and it all starts to change again. I just want people to realise the landscape, the backdrop historically of how we've got to where we are with investing. So if we go back 20 odd years, so nearly 25 years since I've been working in the industry. Investing was really only for the wealthy. So what would happen is that you could invest via a fund manager. So let's just pick one at random, Invesco, for example. And what would happen? You needed to have a significant sum of money. You might have an ISA or investments. You might do that through a financial advisor, because really the only way you could create an investment portfolio was through a broker or an advisor. And you'd have to have a fairly significant sum of money for them to actually take you on as a customer. But what would happen if you wanted to take out an ISA? You'd buy it directly from the investment house, and you'd have a choice of their own funds, and you might build a portfolio of whatever they have on offer. And it was a very expensive way to invest. You might have initial charges of up to 5% on the way in, and charges of a couple of percent a year, including the advisor's fees throughout. So it was expensive. Where we got from there was that we then started to get investment platforms that came along, and they were called fund supermarkets as well, where you could invest in any investment house's products. So they would sign up. It's a bit like you go into a supermarket where you can buy products from all different manufacturers, and then you could fill your shopping cart up and buy what you wanted. So that would create a investment portfolio. And with that came those economies of scale, which brought down the cost of investing, and it made it more accessible to the wider population. So in the end, you had direct to consumer platforms where you could buy investments through those. So think of things like Hargreaves Lansdown, and you also have things like Fidelity, which have a direct to consumer platform. So that is where we got to probably in the early 2000s. And then we moved on from there as time got on, where we saw other platforms emerge, costs start to come down. We saw more range or greater range of investments. We then had robo-advice come along. So robo-advisors, we're talking about things like Nutmeg, Money Farm, those sorts of companies. And what they did was they created more portfolios. So they created funds that you could buy that were very diversified, but they would put you into those. You could take a risk questionnaire, and they would recommend a portfolio in some cases, which they would then look at every year to see how it was matching your attitude to risk and suitability. And then you could put your money in there at a relatively cheap cost, but you also could put in smaller amounts. So a lot of platforms historically needed larger lump sum investments. It was lower than it was, say, 20 years ago, but you might have to have a few £1,000s to put money in, or a couple of hundred at least. That brought those levels down. You could invest from as little as £1. So that was the robo-advice propositions that we had. And it really was trying to give the early stages of a digital version of what the wealth management route was before, where you needed an advisor and you needed input to build portfolios. So I've given you a very high level explanation of what robo-advice propositions are, but that's broadly what they have been. Then we've moved on and we've democratized it further, because where you had, for example, you might have a spending app which mainly dealt with budgeting. They started to offer investment services through them. So you might be able to buy some shares, or you might be able to buy individual funds, but only maybe a few. Then we've had banks starting to get into it, like Monzo. So you can see what we had with investing in history. It started with being only available to the wealthy with very limited choice, and it was very cumbersome, to move all the way to the point where now it's open to everybody, and you will have accessibility to investing at cost-effective rates. And you will even have access, perhaps through things like Monzo, via apps that are already installed on your phone, because you might bank with a company like Monzo, for example, but you haven't actually gone out of your way to decide to access a service to invest. It's getting easier to do it. So the message is, there's never been a better time to be an investor or manage your money, because it's getting easier and easier. So going back to what we were going to talk about, Monzo have launched this service where you can initially start to invest. And Andy's going to give you a quick overview of what that is.
Yeah, so Monzo customers can register their interest. They can't currently actually invest. They can register their interest. From what we've seen, and we've spoken to people who have registered interest, there's around about already 200,000 people in the queue waiting. So there is a lot of interest in this. So in terms of what you can invest in, to start with, the product choice, if you like, you can invest in a stocks and shares ISA or a general investment account. And the initial offering there is 3 ready-made portfolios, and they come at 3 different risk levels. So it's very, very simple. There is a careful portfolio, which is obviously the lowest risk. Then you've got a balanced portfolio, which is middle of the ground. And they also do an adventurous portfolio for those who are happy taking a little bit more risk. And in terms of cost, obviously there are beginner investors here that might not understand how the costs work, but I'll read out what their costs are, and Damien, maybe you'll give a bit more insight into how it sort of fits with the competition later on. It's 0.45% is their platform charge. That's an annual fee you'll pay on your investments. Plus there's an additional fund fee of 0.14%. So around about 0.6, less than 1% charge to be investing with Monzo.
Yeah, and there are discounts in terms of the platform fee if you are one of the Monzo Plus customers or a premium customer. But one thing to bear in mind, you can invest from a minimum of £1, which is attractive. So putting this in the context of where we are with regular investing, you might think, well, I want to get into regular investing. I did want to put money aside, not just put it into cash. And Monzo, is this the answer? Now, the way Monzo is priced is very similar to other propositions out there. So what we're going to do is we're going to I've went from the journey of the old way investing work through to the investment platforms, so the big names like Hargreaves, through to the robo-advisors, and then through to some of these more app-based propositions that have added on investing to their proposition. I'm going to go kind of back the other way when we're trying to talk about where this sits in that universe. So you might be able to sit there and look and think, well, do you know what? I'm quite interested in Monzo, but I also might want to look at this other platform, because all of these platforms that we mentioned, we have created reviews. We've been reviewing these platforms for years. You might not actually realize. So you can find a review of nearly any investment product on the MTTM Assets website. Go on and search. We'll put links to most of them in the notes of this episode. But also importantly, we do compare the cost. So Andy is our resident expert in terms of comparing the cost of all these platforms, because one of the things you've got to realize, it depends on what you want to invest in, and it also depends on how much money you have to invest. So one proposition may be cheaper for one investor, but it actually be more expensive for somebody else because they wanted to invest regularly into, say, shares and want to keep making changes, but that pushes the costs up if they use a particular platform versus somebody who used the same platform and just wanted to buy and hold. So we can't tell you which is going to be best for you, but we can take you on a journey where you can start thinking about the decision process you're going to make. So one thing that's interesting to point out, there are a lot of propositions that are out there that are trying to attract these regular investors, but what they tend to do is charge a monthly fee as well as the platform fee. So when you invest via a platform, you're going to get the charge from the platform because they're going to administer the investments, but also the underlying fund that you pick. So that's the fund charge. But some of these propositions will also add in a regular fee on top of that monthly. But that can be only about £1 in most cases, but that soon stacks up because you think about it, if you have £1 a month, 12 charges a year, so that's £12. Put that on a £1,000 investment, that's basically a 1.2% charge you're paying just to invest on top of the platform fee and the fund fee. And the reason I picked that £1 amount, because that's what Moneybox charges. So that seems to be a bit of an industry standard if you are looking at some of these more app-based propositions that are trying to attract smaller investors. Now, I'm not particularly a fan of those charges because I think it's quite expensive, but Monzo isn't going to charge that, as we've seen from the press releases already. So what other things are there out there to consider? So Invest Engine is one proposition you might want to look at. We've got reviews, like I say, go and look at the reviews of these products. They're quite good if you are wanting to invest in ETFs. So let's say you want to regularly invest, then you want to do that in ETFs, you've decided what you want to pick and choose, then they are pretty good because you can invest in ETFs for free via them. So they do also offer managed portfolios. So they've got 10 growth portfolios. So again, are you the sort of person that wants to pick your investments, or are you the sort of person that wants somebody else to do all the management for you? Then Invest Engine is quite interesting if you are somebody who wants a bit of both. One thing to bear in mind is they don't currently offer shares if you're interested in investing in shares, but they don't do unit trusts. They don't offer the Vanguard life strategy funds, which I know are popular with a lot of people. Moving on from Invest Engine, we have Doddle. They've been recently launched. They are actually a product of AJ Bell, but what they seem to have done is gone out there and looked at what's the best of different propositions out there, and they've pulled it together. So they've got something that's a bit of a hybrid of some of the other models that may be attractive to regular investors. For example, you can invest in a lifetime ISA via Doddle, which you can't on the other propositions I've mentioned so far, like Invest Engine and Monzo. But you can also have a pension. So if you're somebody who wants to start investing in a pension, then Doddle might be interested in ready-made portfolios. They've got themed funds. Their charges are 0.15% per year per account as a platform fee. But they do have a £1 a month minimum charge. And the way that works, it's not on top of the other fees, it means that if they don't stack up to the £1 a month, then you will end up paying £1 a month anyway. So that minimum fee kind of works in a similar way to the Money Box one, but it isn't a flat £1 fee for everybody. So they're an interesting proposition for people because you can invest in shares in the UK and the US, but like all of these things, when you tend to get reduced cost, you tend to get reduced choice. So there's only a choice around 80 UK and US shares. So if you're interested in Monzo, you might be therefore looking, well, have a look at the Doddle review that we've got as well, because it's something that may be attractive to you because it gives you a more choice in terms of the investments, but also the products in terms of the structures, lifetime ISA, stocks and shares ISA, pension, and a general investment account.
Yeah, so you mentioned Moneybox earlier, and they are one of these apps that does charge a £1 per month subscription fee for all of their accounts, except for its pension. They do offer quite a good range of products: stocks and shares ISA, a lifetime ISA, a junior ISA for existing account customers only at the moment, a pension, and a general investment account. And if you're using Moneybox to invest in an ISA, they have 3 ready-made portfolios which you can invest in. And in terms of other costs, they charge a 0.45% annual platform fee on top of that £1 monthly fee for certain accounts. But I do have to say, Moneybox's USP really is the fact that they allow customers to connect it to their bank accounts and do roundups on their spending. So they can invest their small little pennies and bits and pieces of change on their spending and effectively feel like they're investing without actually interacting too much with that. And it does add up.
Yeah, and I'm a real fan of that part of their proposition. So one thing just to point out, that if you use Moneybox, you can just use it as a means to save money without investing. So that's where it really started. So you could have a savings account with them where the roundups, let's say you spent 60p in a shop, it would round up 40p to the nearest pound and put that into the savings account. You can actually ask it to double the amount of money, so it would have been 80p in that example. But there is no £1 fee, subscription fee, if you just use it for savings. So what it means is you could use that to do roundups, but then you could take that money periodically and you could place it into one of the other propositions. So you're kind of getting the roundup feature and using it on another proposition, but it's slightly delayed, if that makes sense. So I do like the Moneybox feature of the roundups. But if you're the sort of person who wants to perhaps put your money aside and then might want to dabble in investing, then Moneybox is one where you've got that on the same platform. They've got savings, but they've got some access to investing. Now, one thing I would say about Moneybox as well is they do have good cash rates. So they often top the best cash lifetime ISA tables on our website. So do bear that in mind as well. So moving on from there, then we've got onto the likes of Plum. Now, Plum is an app that really, to my mind, started life as one of these spending apps, but it's progressed into much more than that. And it's good for automation because it combines spending analysis, we would say AI spending analysis, but also with investing.
Yeah, and it works in a similar way to Moneybox in that it does move money across from your accounts using automation. They call it a roundups feature. It's a little bit different. It doesn't actually work in exactly the same way. It will kind of look at your spending and understand how much it thinks that you can move across based on spending analysis. So very similar feature. It's got themed funds. There are 22 of them at varying risk levels, and you can access up to around about 3,000 shares. So it's very similar to Doddle, who we've mentioned, where you've got that sort of mixture between accessing funds, themed funds and shares. And so in terms of the pricing structure with Plum, it is slightly different. They do have subscription plans very much like Moneybox, but they are more expensive. It's £2.99 per month minimum. They also have a £4.99 plan and a £9.99 plan. And really you're paying more there for slightly reduced management fees and better access to certain investment products.
So when you're looking at all of these, you can see there's different moving parts. Some have lower minimums, like we said. On Moneybox, there was a minimum investment of £1. Plum's the same. If you look at Monzo, it'll be £1, but Invest Engine is £10 and Doddle is £25 a month if you want to be a regular investor. But what you need to do is decide what type of investments you want, whether it is more share-based, whether it's going to be funds, where you want someone to manage a portfolio for you, and then you can compare those costs. 2 others we'll quickly mention. We're not going to go into detail. Wombat, that's quite good for share dealing. There is a review, but also Chip, they're quite good for saving and investing in the same place. But a bit like Moneybox and probably more like Doddle, there is a minimum £1 charge on there a month. So to move this on, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, I want to invest in shares really. I mean, that is up to you if you don't want to build a diversified portfolio. Shares related, there are other propositions that regular investors can use that are also incredibly cheap.
Yeah, so there are commission-free share trading apps. So the most popular ones that people would have probably heard of are Freetrade, eToro, Trading 212, Plus 500. They're just four of the main popular apps that you can get in the UK. And you can download those apps onto your phone and be up and running pretty quickly.
So in terms of charges on those, they work differently, don't they? Because you aren't typically charged a platform fee on those.
No, you're not charged a platform fee and you're not charged for the actual trades themselves. They're labeled as commission free, but there are other charges that you do need to be aware of with these apps. I won't go into detail. We'll put links to what charges you can expect on the certain apps within the notes on this podcast, but things to look out for are things like FX fees if you're doing Forex trading. Sometimes you might see a deposit fee or a currency conversion fee on there. And also they do charge fees, which I think is a little unfair for inactivity. So if you decide to do a lot of share trading this month and you think, do you know what, it's Christmas is coming, I'll pick it up again in the new year. With some apps, if you don't trade for a few months, they'll actually start taking money from your account.
So obviously in Money to Masses, we are advocates of diversified investing for the long term. So we're not really going to go down the road of trying to encourage people just downloading apps and randomly start investing in shares. But there are people out there who will want to invest. What sort of minimums are those platforms got in terms of investments?
So most of those apps that we've just mentioned allow you to do fractional shares. So actually you don't have to buy the shares for the hundreds of pounds they're worth. You can actually buy a fraction of a share, and often that's just from as little as £1.
So that's opened up share trading to people who are just getting into investing in terms of accessibility, but it's also done it in terms of cost, but also people who want to start regularly investing as well. Now, I'm going to move on to the robo-advisors just briefly, because as I mentioned, these propositions came about really as a online wealth management service. So they were designed from the ground up to provide diversified portfolios for people. And they do have apps, most of them, if you look at things like Wealthify, Nutmeg, Money Farm, so you can use them in that way. Now, I'm not going to go into each of those propositions. We've got reviews on all of them, but typically how they will work, they will charge often a fixed fee, which will include the platform charge and the fund charge all in there. It will vary depending on how much you invest. It can be tiered. They will usually offer managed portfolios with a wide range of risk profiles, but some of them, for example, like Money Farm, like Nutmeg, will offer fixed allocation portfolios, which if you think about it, a bit more like something like the life strategy funds that Vanguard do, which are a fixed allocation that doesn't tend to vary, whereas the other types of portfolios are more managed, where they will move the allocation more dynamically. So there'll be an investment committee meeting up and looking at what the portfolio is investing in and change things accordingly. So they really did open up investment to the wider population, but they are just dedicated to investments and pensions. So most of those propositions will have a pension, and they will have things like a stocks and shares ISA, general investment account, and some of them do also have lifetime ISAs. So for example, Nutmeg will have a lifetime ISA that you can use if you want to invest. They won't necessarily offer you at the moment things like cash services, but you've always got to keep watching this space. These things are always changing, because I have to make that caveat. All the things we've mentioned so far on the podcast, these things are changing quite readily. So if you listen to this in the future, do read the reviews, because things can change. They may launch new products and services. So some of those propositions like Wealthify, you can invest from as little as £1, but their charges can vary. I mean, some of them are as low as like 0.6% for the platform charges, but there is a small fund charge that will be there, perhaps something like about 0.2% or something like that, which is just typical of most platforms. Now, moving on, we're looking at the likes of people like Hargreaves Lansdown, AJ Bell, Fidelity, Interactive Investor, the people who are the incumbents in this industry. At one point, some of them used to charge a fee for people who wanted to regularly invest. So people who had monthly amounts going into their investments, they were charged a fixed amount every month for that privilege. And that's largely now been removed from the industry, which is part of this whole journey we've been on to get to the likes of Monzo now offering investments, that you can invest through people like Hargreaves Lansdown, Fidelity, without having to pay a fee for doing so on a regular basis. And they have lower minimums than they used to. Now, I'm not going to go into their minimum investments, but typically on these larger platforms, they're somewhere between £25 a month and £100, and lump sum investments typically also range from about £100 upwards. So it is more accessible to people now than it used to be. But the thing is, you get with these platforms is that you get much greater choice in terms of what you can invest in. So a range of different investment types, including shares, including investment trusts, ETFs, unit trusts. And some of these platforms also have cash savings platforms attached to them where you can move your money around more easily to different institutions to try and get better interest rates. Hargreaves Lansdown has one, AJ Bell has one as well. So these propositions are where the investment choices become more serious. You have far more options. But these platforms are no longer just for those people who are more sophisticated investors.
No, absolutely not. There's much greater access to these services now. And let's not forget, they do offer, because they're larger and they generally have more employees and bigger assets in terms of assets under management, they can do things like additional research, and they offer great tools when compared to the apps that we've discussed earlier.
And of course, because they offer a range of products, they don't just have their own, in some cases they don't even have their own funds that they would offer, but they will have best buy lists, they'll have research around that to help people choose portfolios. But where these platforms obviously become much more interesting is when you have more significant sums of money invested, because they often have tiered charging structures, which means that your fees technically become slightly cheaper, at least on portions of your money, the more you have invested with them.
And another great thing about them is often they will offer free accounts for things like junior ISAs. So, for example, Interactive Investor, if you want to invest in a junior ISA, there's no additional cost for that. And it's the same for Fidelity and also Hargreaves Lansdown.
So at this end, you're becoming much more cost focused. Like Interactive Investor, for example, has fixed fees. So you'll be looking at things like that, weighing up the cost. Now, we do have heat maps on the website, which Andy updates regularly, which compares the cost for different size portfolios and different types of investments for all different types of platforms, all those we've mentioned, even the robo-advice propositions. Also, bear in mind that with these larger platforms, you can have additional services usually added on as well for a cost. So you might have financial advice. So you might have things like inheritance tax planning that you could ask to have on some of these platforms, which some of the other propositions that we mentioned much earlier are just streamlined and they don't offer such services. So hopefully we've given people a real breadth and a whistle-stop tour of how to get into investing, what platforms to look at, which reviews to go and look at. So one of the things I just want to mention before we finish this part of the podcast is that you and I were talking before the show that if you're using some of these apps to just get investing, just to start, because I do think it's important to start investing rather than let inertia and that choice, that paradox of choice of propositions out there stop you even trying. It's more important that you start, because obviously you can change platforms at a later date. And now I can't think of a platform that has exit fees applied. I think now you don't have that at all, and it's largely gone from the industry. And it's not just because of legislation. That already happened a few years ago that we started to lose exit fees. So you can change at some point. We were talking about a number in the air that when you start investing, at what point when you're using some of these smaller apps, would you then think, well, I could probably get better value, better choice if I move to another bigger platform that's out there?
Yeah, again, lots of caveats attached to this. Let's just mention that because it will be different depending on the type of investor you are. But finger in the air, we think around about 10,000. If you've got £10,000 invested, you've started this journey via whichever means, whether it's a robo, whether it's an app. Once you've got that 10,000, I think that opens up the opportunity for you to look around and reassess whether it's choice of products or whether it's cost or where it is you need to go, because you've got much more flexibility to sort of chop and change then.
Yeah, and also don't forget at that point, because you've got more money, you'll probably start changing the investments you have. So you might use slightly different investments. You might start thinking about, I don't know, maybe you might do a bit of share dealing or whatever it is you then need to review. But I think that is probably a decent finger in the air. And the other reason, that's often a point where there is changes in charges on their tier structures as well. So start investing. That's the main thing. There's lots of good propositions out there that are cost effective, that can get you into investing. Don't feel like you've got to go and buy shares straight away. I don't think that's the sensible thing at all. That's a high risk strategy. You can go in and there are diversified portfolios out there that are extremely cheap that you can get into. It's more about the habit of regularly investing. It's open to everybody. Get into the habit. And then as your portfolio grows over time, then you can start looking around and reviewing it, because just like you review your investments, you should also periodically review the process, the platforms that you use to make sure that you're getting the most out of your money. Because the one thing you can control when investing, you can't control the markets, but you can control costs.
And as a final throwaway, just before we finish, we've done lots on this before, and I'm sure you've bored of hearing it. Emergency fund. Make sure you've got access to an emergency fund before you start deep diving into investing. Savings rates are amazing right now. Do that first.
Every so often you read a book or you come across something in life that has a real material impact and changes you for the better. And many moons ago, you've got to think that Andy and I, when we first met, and it was 20 years ago, and we probably, if you'd met us at the time, probably found us in the pub more often than we probably weren't in the pub. And you probably would have seen us drinking and smoking quite heavily and enjoying ourselves and having fun. And as time goes on, you grow up and you start to think that you don't want to do these things anymore. And don't forget, these were the days when you could smoke in pubs, and you decide you're going to give up smoking.
And this was pre-relationships, pre-children. We had nothing better to do effectively after work, and the pub was right next door. And it was convenience. And obviously we like to sort of catch up over the football.
Yeah, so it's like those good old days, some people refer to them as. And it was a period after which you grow up, and then we decided that obviously you want to give up smoking because it's bad for you. And at the time, I tried different ways, just pure willpower. I didn't do patches or anything like that, but I can't remember how I came across something called Alan Carr's The Easy Way. And it's in reference to a book that you read to help you give up smoking. And when I say Alan Carr, it's not the comedian, it's spelt differently. It's Allen and Carr Carr. Now, the book was in some ways life-changing, because by reading this very short book and smoking while you read the book, by the end of it, you will have given up smoking. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, but given that it worked for me and it worked for you, didn't it, Andy?
Did, yep, absolutely.
And it effectively uses an element of psychology and reverse brainwashing in a way to help you overcome addictions. And the reason it's relevant for this podcast is because Andy's been reading another book from the same author in relation to sleep.
Yeah, that's right. And not that I have a problem with sleeping, but I was in the bookshop anyway. We were actually at a book signing, and they're very clever the way they do it. They snaked you round the bookstore, and it was in the corner there, sort of shouting at me. And it was Alan Carr's Easy Way to Better Sleep. And while I don't have trouble sleeping, I probably don't sleep enough. I don't prioritise my sleep. And I thought, do you know what? I could probably read that and get something from it. So I bought it, started reading it, and there were so many similarities to the smoking book, the psychology, and just common sense. And I love the book, and actually since reading that I've gone an extra 2 or 3 hours a night extra sleep, and it's pretty good stuff.
So we were talking about this in the office, and I said I didn't realise that they'd done other books. I thought it was really just around the sort of smoking and drinking. There's another one that they do in some other addictions, and there is actually one around debt. So it's how to get out of debt. And the book, the original one on smoking, is a book that I recommend to lots of people. So there aren't many books that you come across in life that you really do think have a material impact and change your life in a certain way. But this was a book for me where I was able to give up smoking, and Andy said he's used it as well. And the idea that they had one for debt, I found incredibly intriguing, therefore. So what I've done is I've read the book, and we're going to do a piece on the podcast which is going to just sort of explain what the book talks about, because it's a different way at looking at the debt problem. So there'll be people here listening to this podcast who may have debt, they want to pay it off, and rather than berate you about you should know better, it's the same as smoking, telling somebody that they shouldn't be smoking. They know that it doesn't work for everybody. They won't necessarily give up. Let's be honest, cigarettes are hidden behind counters that you can't see, and they now have pictures of diseased lungs and things like that on it. And if it was pure fact that would drive people to give up smoking, there wouldn't be smokers. It just shows that it doesn't work for everybody. So sometimes just telling people how to get out of debt is not enough. It's not going to be for everybody. So to give you a one example where you can do things differently, and it's about psychology. If you recall, we talked about clearing debt in the past before you invest. So you have the stages to become financially independent, and we'll put a link in the podcast actually to a past episode that was incredibly popular. We talked about it, and there are different ways of doing it. That you need to get rid of debt before you start building up. Emergency funds is one method, or start investing. And there was a guy called Dave Ramsey in America who is a kind of a financial guru. Well, he's a bit like us, to be honest. He's got a podcast, everything like that. And one of the methods that he has about becoming effectively financially independent, he says you should have a £1,000 buffer put in place before you clear your debts, because it breaks the cycle of using debt. And the idea being that, therefore, if your car tyre blows up and you need to repair that, you're not relying on a credit card. You've got the money to spend on that tyre, and then
and you can fill that fund back up as you get the money from your next pay packet, avoiding running up any more debts. And that way you do break that cycle. But Alan Carr's book takes a completely different view, because with his book and his way of helping people to get rid of debt and overcome that is to actually break the psychology of it and why you do it. Why do you have debt? Why do you spend lots of money or more money than you have? Which, just by having £1,000 buffer, it might break the cycle of why you're immediately spending. But if fundamentally you are somebody who's going to keep spending all of the time, there's a deeper rooted problem. So the books tend to, whatever the addiction, they tend to work by following a set methodology. And one of the parts of that methodology is that you shouldn't question what you're reading, you just read it with an open mind. And you've read them, Andy, and they're quite hypnotic in the way they're written.
Yeah, that's right. And to be honest, that is the fundamental part of the book. That is how it works. It works by repeating the same message, asking you to be open-minded, and then slowly but surely it helps to, it's like an onion, it peels away the layers. It starts to break down the things that were causing the problem in the first place, and it starts to make sense. And if it only did it once or twice, or only covered the same things once or twice, I don't think the message quite gets through. It's the fact that it keeps going on that same theme and message that eventually you get it.
Yeah, and so don't forget they have different centres around the world where people could go and get help with different addictions. And what they do is allow you to understand that spending in a way that you do it when you accrue lots of debt is effectively an addiction. You have an addiction to spending money. And so he calls it junk spending. And the initial chapters of the book look at the misconceptions around debt and spending. It emphasizes that overspending is an addiction fueled by an illusion that spending brings pleasure, an idea that's perpetrated by like large retail companies. So you've got to think, when you look at the TV, you have adverts, magazines, whatever, there are products being pushed at you that are associating certain things. They're using an element of brainwashing to associate ideas of pleasure with their product. So the product fundamentally may not be a product that's a positive to you. So they even give examples in the book, things like chocolate bars. So it may be that the idea of the chocolate bar that they present on a TV advert has all sorts of other things about relaxation, people in baths. It has this scene. It sells you an ideal that you therefore want to be associated with, but fundamentally a chocolate bar is something that's high in sugar and very bad for you. So if they just told you what the product did, you wouldn't buy it. What you're actually selling is not the product, they're selling an idea. And you think back about cigarette adverts, alcohol adverts, they don't necessarily sell you the product, they're selling you this ideal. And so what you're doing is you're getting brainwashed about the things that you don't need, so you go and buy them. So it's a bit like that phrase, you buy things you don't need to almost ultimately impress people you don't even like. So the process works by showing you this brainwashing, and it kind of reverse brainwashes you. So it starts to show that this is what is happening to you. This is why you spend lots of money on junk spending, buying things that you don't want. The problem is actually your belief that you will feel better by buying something. And there's some really good examples in the book that they give. There's examples of an idea of, say, a father has a child, and the child just wants their dad to play with them, but the dad is busy, and what the dad does, because he feels guilty about that, he therefore goes out and buys a toy for his child, and the child therefore is momentarily happy with that toy, but eventually throws it against the wall, throws a tantrum, breaks it, because all the child really fundamentally wants is attention and love. But the dad then sees that, gets angry, there's a big blow up, and he feels guilty. So what he does is he goes out and buys another better toy, and the child therefore likes that toy, feels positive for a moment in time, and it goes on and on and on, and you get into this cycle. But fundamentally what's happening is the dad is spending money because he thinks the spending is going to ultimately produce some sort of pleasure and solve problems. But really the problem is the relationship with his child and the fact that he's working, and what he really should be doing is thinking about the things that are free in life. And so he ends up having a spending addiction effectively by doing something repetitively because he believes it's going to make his life better. I want to give you an example I remember from the book regarding smoking, and they do use the same analogies in the one for debt. Is that, let's say everybody who doesn't smoke have a score out of 100, they feel 100, so they're at a normal level, they feel good. When they then smoke, they might feel this kind of bit wonky immediate sort of pickup or whatever it might be, but after smoking their score drops to a 95, but the initial buzz they got from taking that drug, that nicotine drug, therefore made them feel kind of good. So what happens if they were to be honest, if they rated themselves out of 100, they've dropped down a bit, and then what they do is they try and therefore smoke another cigarette in an attempt to effectively feel that real buzz again. But what they're really doing is trying to get back to 100. But then after they smoke that cigarette, as they smoke more and more, if they gave themselves a score out of 100, they'd be down to about 90. And so they smoke a cigarette again to make them feel better, but it only gets them up to 95. But then after the come down, they go down to about 85, and then they smoke another cigarette and they get up to about 90. Effectively, what you're doing is the same as somebody who would wear a really tight pair of shoes just to get the relief, that moment when they take their shoes off. So when you have an addiction like smoking, it really only makes you feel worse. You get back to a level that's not even the same as somebody who isn't a smoker. So you are under this illusion, and in debt, it works in the same way. By overspending, they talk about it gives you this brief moment of feeling like somebody who doesn't have any debt. So it's an illusion of pleasure. So the reality is you're using debt to get the feeling of somebody who doesn't have debt, what it would be like. And it's just an illusion because you're accruing more and more. You're going to keep buying things to give you that feeling. I'll make myself feel better. I'm going to go and buy something in the shops, whatever that may be, that retail therapy. But you're getting further away from that feeling of normality. Somebody who doesn't have debt, like the smoker, the more they smoke, the worse they feel. They feel like they're getting better, but they're in a cycle.
And what's really clever about the book is by the end of the book, if you've read it correctly and you've understand the techniques, is it helps to teach you to change that feeling of pleasure. That feeling of pleasure comes from not spending. So using the smoking as an example, when you get those what are called cravings or pangs that you get, and you get that little monster inside that's desperate for a cigarette, and then you cure it by having a cigarette, what you're able to do in the smoking book is cure that feeling of emptiness and like itchy craving. You cure that by reminding yourself that you're not a smoker and that you don't need it. And it's a really clever bit of psychology that you are able to actually cure yourself purely by understanding that you no longer need what you thought was the problem. Do you understand that?
I mean, I totally understand, because obviously it cured me of smoking, but it is that psychology. Because even now, going back all those years when I read the book 20 years ago, I can still remember the idea of like, yeah, but when I smoke that cigarette, I'm actually going back down to like a 95 and eventually going lower and lower, and only just getting back to a level that's much lower than somebody who doesn't smoke. The analogy of walking around wearing overly tight shoes all day long just to get the feeling of, that sort of illogical concept is effectively what you do when you smoke.
And using the debt idea then, where you can hopefully read the book and then understand that your behaviours are perhaps the problem, whereas normally you would then spend to make yourself feel better. Once you understand that that isn't truly the case, hopefully you'll get the feeling of pleasure by cutting that off, understanding that that was what the problem was, and then actually getting pleasure from looking at your bank account and thinking, well, there's 10 or 15 pounds sitting in my bank that I wouldn't have had previously because I would have spent it. So you get the pleasure from the saving rather than the spending element.
Exactly. And the book doesn't berate you. It does shine a light. There'll be things about it that you might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but go with an open mind. The concept is quite interesting. For some people who aren't able just to go kind of cold turkey when it comes to debt, this might be something that might be helpful for them. And so what it does, it also starts to help you understand that aha moment. Yes, this is how the world works. This is how retail works. This is how marketing messages work. A good example, I've always talked on the podcast about, I think credit cards should be rebranded as debt cards. And funnily enough, he actually uses that same phrase in the book. And the idea that a credit card doesn't give you control. There's an idea that you've been sold that credit cards give you the ability to take control in the world because they give you the ability to buy things. There's always a positive connotation. But what you're really doing, as soon as you have a credit card, you're giving over all control you have of your finances to a debt company. So a credit card company, they dictate how much you can spend. You have a credit card limit, for example. They dictate where your income goes because things cost more if you buy them on debt, because don't forget they add interest. So it starts dictating how much you pay for things, and it therefore dictates what you can afford and what you can't afford. So the idea is that it starts to make you look at the world of debt very differently. And I think people who've come through that journey of having lots of debt and clearing it, they end up there. They start to realise the traps that are there for people. They don't give you debt because they like you. They give you debt because they want you to get into one of those spirals. It's like when you see these nature programs when there's a plant that's laid a trap effectively for a fly to go into, and the next minute the fly's got stuck and has ended up basically falling inside the nectar or whatever it is in a plant. They use the analogy in the book actually, and it ends up effectively getting eaten alive by the plant and dissolved. And that idea is the sort of Venus flytrap. We see it throughout finance. So it starts to help you look at that problem. And understand it. So in the end, the book does come up with practical steps, but the thing is, we provide lots of practical steps. You can see lots of practical steps of how you clear debt. What this is interesting is because it helps you understand the psychology of what's going on and how you can therefore overcome it. But one thing I just want to point out, I know a lot of people like the idea when I've talked in the past about spending plans rather than budget. So if you look at the idea that a budget can have connotations as being quite negative, so you're depriving yourself of something, the book starts to reframe a lot of things. You realize that actually by clearing debt, you're not depriving yourself of anything. You're actually now giving yourself control, and you're actually, it's a positive thing. You're making positive choices. And what it means, you can start to spend money on the things that make you happy. The book starts moving into the direction about happiness. What does it mean? It's not about the things you own. It's about the things that you often do, the things you enjoy. It starts making things positive. It gives a very, very good example of how a day a guy has where he goes to meet a friend. He starts becoming stressed about the amount of money it's costing to go for this meal. And when he goes there and other people are ordering rounds of drinks, and he basically ends up a miserable day, ruins his friend's birthday. Fundamentally, it comes down to the idea of his view of money and the debt that he had. Had he viewed the same day in a different way, where it was much more positive, it's about, I'll get to see my friends, and he's already been in control in terms of, I've got money to spend on this event, that kind of thing. Seeing the same day in two different ways, he looks at it saying that if you gain control of your debt, what you're really doing is allowing yourself to spend money on the things you want to do, which would be going to see friends or doing things, and not feeling bad or worried about doing that because of the debt pile that you've got that's partly a result of the brainwashing you've received from marketing, the tricks from the credit card company. So overall, we've talked a lot about the book, and you might sit there and think, God, it's almost like an advertorial for it. It's a different process, but it was a book and a process that did have a material impact on me for giving up smoking. Same thing for Andy.
I'll happily say as well at this point, Damien, I used it to give up drink as well. I was a heavy drinker. I used to drink in the bars of London. I used to work in the city. And I made a decision that with a young daughter and a full life ahead of me, I should perhaps tackle that. And I did it through the book. I wouldn't have considered myself an alcoholic, but I was a habitual drinker. And I just used the steps in the book. And since I read that book, I've not touched a drop of alcohol. So it is actually a life-changing book for me personally. It's not an advertorial, but I don't mind giving it some time on the podcast.
Yeah, and so we're going to put a link to it in the show notes. And one of the key things about the book, it's about talking about money, and it's about talking about things more openly, because then you understand you are not alone. This isn't a safety in numbers exercise. By sharing, you start to realise what is really happening out there, the brainwashing that's going on, and the things that you can do to counter that. And the thing that talking about money also does, and the book alludes to it, is that you realise these problems are universal. So just because people are rich or a lot richer than you doesn't mean they haven't got debt problems. Their debt problems are just probably a lot bigger, because there are a lot of people who live beyond their means and they've got lots of money, and yet they have huge amounts of debt, and then sometimes it can all come crashing down. So it starts to make you realise that situation. And the real thing is, it makes you think about taking positive action, and that process of reading something that's going to start to help you move in the right direction. And it's like the old proverb of every journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step.
Okay, so there we have it. The bumper episode of our highlights from 2023 is done. And so the next episode that you'll hear is our New Year's Eve episode. Again, we don't expect you to be tuning in on New Year's Eve. It's likely going to be something you listen to in the new year. And in fact, that is exactly what that episode is designed for. It's our 2024 look ahead to what 2024 will bring. So I hope you did have a great Christmas. Damien, bringing you back in. We're done, not just for this week's episode, we're done for this year.
Yeah, and I would like to add to people, thank you for all your support throughout the year. Do send in the reviews, because I will read out some reviews in the new year. So once we come back, send in your reviews. You could win a Money to the Masses mug if your review is read out. I have a couple that I've kept aside from this week, but please do make sure you send in your reviews, because they do really motivate us and the team, because we do share them around the team. But as ever, do make sure you follow us on YouTube. You also follow us on all our social platforms. So that's Instagram, Facebook. Join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. And when we get into 2024, it's going to be a resolution of ours to be a lot better at trying to encourage you to share our podcast and support the podcast going forward. So Andy, I think that is it. Until next time.
Until next year.